Hey, what's up? John Sonmez here from SimpleProgrammer.com. So I've been sick. I actually haven't been doing videos. So I'm catching up here. Just got back from a trip. Got back from Thanksgiving holiday, and who knows when this video will come out. It'll probably be a couple weeks after this. But got pretty sick. Actually lost my voice, which is like the worst thing that can happen for me, right? So I can do a couple of videos, but I'm catching up. I had a good buffer, and so I had a little bit of room there, and I will make sure that I always get my 2 videos at least per day out there. Anyway, today, what are we going to be talking about? Well, I'm going to be doing a book review today. I actually read a book over the holidays. I read what I thought was going to be a totally different kind of book than what it actually was. It's one of those books that, when I read the title, it excites me. And the title of this book is called Manliness, right? I mean, obviously, that's manliness. Yeah, there you go. It's by Harvey Mansfield. What a guy to write a book called Manliness. I don't remember where I came across this book. I think I was looking at recommendations on Goodreads. Someone had read this, or multiple people who I follow had read this book. And so I thought, okay, I definitely explore this topic a lot. For you guys that are interested, I've got a whole playlist on becoming a better man and attracting women. And so I do a lot of research in this area, obviously because it pertains to me as a man, but it also pertains to those of you that are watching these videos that could use some guidance in this area. So let me tell you about this book, why it was different than what I thought it was. So this was more of an academic book. The person who wrote this obviously was a philosophy or political science major because he came from a very philosophical background. So the book was very, very difficult to read. It was not exciting at all. It was very, very dry. But that doesn't make it bad. It makes the writing, I mean, honestly, I'm going to say that I don't think the writing was so good. And I'll be honest with you, I'd rather have, even if the book is really meant to be academic, I'd rather it be conversational and entertaining, because it's very, very difficult to get through something and get the information out of it if it's not presented in that way. And I know that so many writers write in such a formal tone because it's professional, but it's just not the way to write. It just doesn't make sense. I think most people are really shitty writers. I've just been realizing how shitty so many writers are. It sucks. But that's just how it is. I think a lot of people just don't take the risk, and they're afraid of sounding stupid, so they come off with a very, very formal and very educated tone, which makes it just really hard to digest the information and to be excited about the book. So I don't mean to knock the book, because I think the book has some good content in it for sure, but it's not a book that I'm going to recommend to all of you, because I think that most of you won't get enough out of it, and most of you won't get through the book. I hate to recommend books that I don't think you're going to get through. Now, if you're really, really a student of what I would say manliness, not manliness, it's more like masculinity versus femininity, or feminism, and that kind of political type of philosophy, you'll find it interesting. Or if you're extremely into philosophy, right, into old philosophy and some of the newer philosophy, because he does go through and he does go and talk and quote people like Spinoza and John Stuart Mills, and goes back to Socrates and Plato and Plato's Republic, and he goes through a bunch of feminine philosopher authors and whatnot as well. And so the book itself, what is this book about? It is essentially about, it asks the question of what exactly is manliness, what is its place. We're moving towards this, quote, gender-neutral society. Can we actually do that? Or is manliness, or that attribute of manliness, what is it? Is it biological, and does it serve a purpose? Does it need to exist, right? And if so, how do we deal with this, right? So, he goes off first by defining what manliness is, and he defines it different than masculinity, or he uses the term manliness, but essentially it comes out to the word aggression, which is more more focused when it's being assertive. And I would agree with that definition. I think manliness is probably could be equated to being assertive. I mean, I think there's probably a broader scope to it, but I think for the most part, if you're going to summarize things down to being aggressive and assertive, that is, and that's definitely a destructive force in the world, but it's also a necessary force, because you got to have someone who is going to keep the bad guys out and is going to do the things that most of society is not willing to do, and that's going to require men to do. Now, he talks about how most of society is moving towards this gender neutral society, and this is being pushed, especially by feminist movements. Then he gets into the history of feminist movements. It's kind of interesting when you look at what he talks about. He talks about this concept of feminism essentially basically trying to make women men, essentially to give women access to the attributes of manliness and what they call the patriarchy, and to basically have these attributes to completely eliminate any of the stereotypical attributes of a woman, or femininity, as I'd call it, and to basically say, no, we're all sort of the same, and we can all sort of, become this idealized attribute, which is the assertiveness, maleness, manliness, and he talks about how that's, kind of flawed thinking in the feminist movement. And he dissects it. He's pretty fair with what he says, but it comes down to this kind of circular loop, which I think is kind of interesting, what I extracted from the book as far as feminism goes, which is this idea that feminists want women to be able to compete, to be equal with men in terms of access to resources and the opportunities, and that they want to be treated as men, essentially, like that. This whole everyone judged by the same kind of standard that men have been judged by in the man's kind of world, right? But the problem with that, which he kind of highlights in the book, is that when you do that, one of the things that exists in that world of a meritocracy is essentially that the strong will survive, or that might is right. And when you get down to it, biologically, men are stronger than women, and so you sort of get to this question of, well, why should I rule you? Because the strongest is what rules, right? That's sort of how this patriarchal society has been constructed. Whether you believe it or not, whether you agree with it or not, throughout history, strong might has been right? The strongest rules. The authority of ruling someone comes from, I'm stronger than you, I've conquered you in some way. And so when you get down to that, and if women feminists become that, then we come down to this same place where we say, well, by what authority do you propose to rule over me? By the authority of the fact that I'm stronger, right? So that it ends up going to this circular kind of logic where it just doesn't make sense, right? When you think about that from that perspective. Now, I'm not necessarily agreeing with that particular point that's how society should go, but I'm just saying that that's how the world, at least the world of men, works. If you want to enter into the world of men, the world of men works in such a way. Manliness defines that the stronger is the victor, right? The stronger has the authority to rule by virtue of being stronger. But and you could say that, well, does that make sense? Does that make sense as law? Is that fair? Is that correct? It doesn't fucking matter, because you can't stop the stronger from ruling. And that's what it kind of comes down to from a very biological nature-driven perspective, is the reason why, whether you agree with it from an ethical standpoint or if it's the best way to be governed or ruled, is just simply because you can't stop the stronger from imposing their will and their domination on the weaker from a biological. This is in the man's world. Now, he also talks about how we move into society and how society tends to damper or tamp down the manliness, because you kind of have to. Because if manliness is all about assertion and aggression, and you want to have an actual society, you want to actually have peace, you don't have people killing each other all the time, you have to sort of say, well, you gotta have to put the manliness on hold in order to have some kind of civil laws. We're gonna have to, and he talks about some of the philosophy behind this, and some of the actual liberalist philosophers. Now, liberalism in this sense, in a philosophical sense, does not mean the same thing as liberalism, as like a liberal today, as like a Democrat, right? It's a different kind of liberalism. It just means freedom, essentially, like the freedom of man, or man's will to assert his own, or man's right to assert his own will upon himself, to self-govern, essentially, right? So he talks about this concept of essentially, like, in order to have society, we have to make some kind of trade-offs. We can't really just have men being manly men all the time. We have to, and this kind of brings the rise to the kind of the gender neutral society, and where's the place for manliness here? But there's different philosophers. Rousseau was one of them, who he points out that actually still kind of marry the two, and we're sort of in a place where politically, things are driven by some amount of manliness, right? Some kind of aggression and assertiveness is really how our government, most of the governments in the world that have some kind of democracy or republic work. So there's still that element of it, even though it's trying to be suppressed and men are being emasculated around the world. But there's some reasoning for this, right? It does make sense to some degree that you have to damn this aspect, otherwise people are always at war. And sort of what the justification he makes for this is to basically say that, people fear, they fear basically being killed all the time. And so it's kind of a mutual agreement between men to say, like, well, you know what, maybe we should have some kind of society and give up a little bit of our rights and our assertion over what we can take or dominate in order to live in peace, because peace is a little bit better than fearing being killed all the time. Now, I might disagree with this to some degree. I think that maybe that we've gone too far in this direction, but he really goes in depth and into exploring these things. So again, this is something that I've extracted from the book. It takes a lot to extract it from the book because it's not an easy read. So again, I'm not going to recommend this for everyone, but I'm giving you sort of an in-depth analysis of this so that if you don't read the book, you can at least get some of what he's saying. So then it comes down to really this question of, and he addresses the biological question, obviously, manliness, the different attributes of sex differences are biologically proven, that we can't just blank slate people and say, okay, everyone is exactly the same and they don't have different inclinations. Men and women are different, and those differences are necessary, right? And so he goes through all of those arguments, of course, but then he comes out to the end and he says, okay, so what is the place he calls, I think the last chapter of the book is something like unemployed manliness. And so he's talking about, so where does this fit in society today? And what he comes to is what I would say is kind of the obvious conclusion, right? I think this is probably the conclusion that I would agree with for the most part, and most people would agree with, and society is sort of settled on, although, I suppose we're trying to move to this ridiculous place where we completely eliminate masculinity of any form. But but it comes down to this basic conclusion. His conclusion essentially says that manliness and masculinity essentially has its place, like the sex differences have their place in the private world where they're necessary, the polarization, right? The things that actually make relationships and male-female relationships work, that we can't just be the same, because we don't want everyone to be the same at that level, in the what you'd call the private level. But in the public level, that it's more of a gender-neutral society. Meaning that, and what do I mean by private and public in this case? In public, he's talking about in the eyes of the law, in the career, right? In general terminology and dealing with people and whatnot, we don't need to treat men and women differently. Obviously, offer the same opportunities, legally you treat them the same as well. But in the private, in the household, in the non-public, right, that'd be, it's not just in the household, but in the non-quote public, in the non-legal sense, that those differences are important and need to exist. So it's a bit of a cop-out answer. It's not as tough as I would have taken on it, but it makes sense. Like, I mean, it's a very, again, this is very much in the political, in the philosophical realm of this. There's not very much practicality here, so there's not really like good examples of this, and it doesn't really go into depth into defining manliness or masculinity and in developing that trait if you're interested, but it does really debate back and forth kind of throughout history, throughout the last probably 200 or 300 years, and actually going back to Socrates and Plato, where the place of manliness is, what it does to society, and do we need it, and how's it important, and what happens when we try to get rid of it completely, or what happens if we try to move everyone to it. So he goes through all of those things and sort of gives you that perspective. So worth a read, like I said, only if you're ready for some pain and you're willing to dig into it. It's also a very, very long book. I've kind of given you the basics of the ideas here. Like I said, I can't really totally disagree with the idea. The sad thing is, though, that the conclusion that he comes to after all that is basically what the default, society is today, which kind of, I think it's the most sensible conclusion that most people would come to, which is that, like, from a very public standpoint, there really shouldn't be any sex differences, but from a private standpoint, yeah, everyone wants there to be, essentially. Like, whether they acknowledge it at a conscious level or not, it's necessary and important, and we're never going to eliminate this. I think this is one of the things, is that because it's so biologically driven, and because it's so necessary, even for feminists, to adopt manliness in order to succeed in the world, that it's not going to be eliminated. So you got to deal with it one way or another. If you haven't subscribed already, if you haven't gotten all of my videos here, if you want to see some of the reviews I've done, I usually read about 2 to 3 books a week. You can check out the playlist here of all my video reviews of my books, and then make sure you click the subscribe button below, click the bell so you don't miss any videos. I'll talk to you next time. Take care.